Disunited. The start, Manchester divided, Old Trafford dressing room split apart. And we are going to start with the Telegraph. And Sam, that's your paper, so let's get straight into it then. Squad are turning on strict Ten Hag. It sounds like he's close to losing this dressing room.
Well, they're suggesting quite specifically in the story in the Telegraph by my colleagues is that that the players disagree with some of his hardline stance with two players in particular. That's Jadon Sancho, whose sort of exile from the first team squad has been going on now for quite some considerable time, and also his treatment of Harry Maguire, who is back in the team at the moment, but there appears to be some dissent as to how this has been handled by the manager. He's clearly a pretty no-nonsense character. That's been his sort of motif from the start, and indeed in the way that he quite successfully managed Cristiano Ronaldo out of the club. I think the story as it stands is quite specific. It's around those two players. It's disquiet in the squad about the handling of it. And obviously, look, I mean, United they're in, I think they've had 8 defeats already this season. Clearly there are problems there. Evidently you could see from the way Ten Hag reacted to last night's result how crestfallen he was at the performance, and naturally newspapers are now looking at why that is the case. And this is a well-sourced story that suggests that all is not well in the dressing room, as you might expect.
Yeah, I mean, Jonathan, the Times are suggesting that, and they use the word kind of thin ice, Erik Ten Hag on thin ice, and also that they're starting to consider alternatives, which is something that the club have strongly refuted. They call this categorically false, that they're exploring alternatives. But there seems to be a bit of momentum with this.
Yeah, I mean, I actually believe United when they say they're not considering alternatives to Ten Hag at the moment, because that would require some kind of foresight. It would require some sort of strategic planning, and I generally don't think they're capable of that. So I take that at face value. I mean, to be serious, I mean, Ten Hag was brought in as a long-term project, and his first season, as we've discussed many times before on this show, was pretty decent. He won a trophy, he got them back into the Champions League, and there is very little point in committing to a project and backing it with huge transfer spending in the summer if you're then going to bin it basically at the start of November, 2 or 3 months into the new season. There is clearly huge structural problems, and I think problems that go far beyond the coach, far beyond the playing squad, right up to the top, to the Glazers and the mismanagement of the club over the last 2 decades. That's not going to change with a new coach. And I think that the problem that United have got into, going back years and years, is this search for a quick fix, for a miracle solution, a new signing, a new coach, something that's just going to magically make everything back to how it was again. And that's not how football works, and United should know that by now.
Yeah, so we're going to move on to the Express, and Sam, this kind of quite powerful and simple headline, Disunited. I mean, obviously things aren't right. We can see that by the results. Are they disunited? Is that too strong? I mean, there are some mitigating factors with injuries and Marcus Rashford not banging in the goals like he was last year. Is there a case to say actually United maybe overachieved last year and this is a little bit more where they're actually at?
Yeah, quite possibly. I think the problem with all those sort of summaries is that they've spent so much to be this mediocre. It's cost. I mean, I think Ten Hag alone has spent around 300-400 million in transfer fees, and the players that have come in. I mean, they have some good players, but I think for that sort of wage bill for those kind of fees, one would expect them to have far more great players. And I think that is essentially the problem with United, is that it's not a bad side, although they're in a real slump at the moment. The trouble is that for the club they are and the amount they spend on wages and fees, it's really nothing like realising the value of the cost. So in terms of the players themselves, clearly, it's a familiar story that Jonathan sort of summarised there, is that it's a squad that's been assembled by a number of different managers, and there has never been a very powerful sporting director at the club who has a vision for the way that United should recruit and indeed recruit managers. They very much backed Ten Hag in the transfer market with the kind of players that he knows. I mean, evidently they've signed a lot of players from Holland or even players like Mason Mount who've played in Holland, and these tend to be the ones that that Ten Hag feels he can rely upon. So Onana, Anthony, these are clearly Ten Hag signings. If we look at the way that clubs tend to work in the modern era, well, the successful ones have a much a sort of long-reaching vision, which is executed by a sporting director who recruits managers and players according to that. And yes, United just seem to leap from manager to manager. They still have a real kind of faith. I think that's clearly born of the Alex Ferguson years, that there's one man who can unlock the problem, who can solve the problem rather. And history, well, certainly the last decade, is telling us that that's just not the case.
Okay, the Star says it's a similar theme. Manchester divided, Old Trafford dressing room, Jonathan, split apart. Just wondering, because Sam alluded to it, the management style of Erik ten Hag. He's brought in to be this kind of disciplinarian. It worked with Cristiano Ronaldo, perhaps, or it was certainly quite a popular move. Not so, perhaps, with Jadon Sancho and Harry Maguire. The best managers, it strikes me at the moment, the ones having most success, Pep Guardiola, who seems like he's demanding, but his arm round the shoulder. Ange Postecoglou similarly seems very kind of positive. I know things are going well. But in the modern game, how easy is it to gel that disciplinarian manager with the kind of modern, highly paid, highly pampered group of footballers?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually, because it's a very different skill set from what Ten Hag has had to do in the past. And this is no slight on him as a coach, but the job he has to do at Ajax, where the culture is basically already established for him. He has to be the custodian of that tradition. There is a very strong backroom team, sporty directors and executives who are all kind of pulling in the same direction. There is a traditional Ajax way, and United, he basically has to build that culture. He has to remake it from the ground up. That's not to say he can't do it, but it needs time. And it needs a lot of patience, and it needs the whole company, the whole organization, as it were, pulling together. And you can't do that when the owner essentially absentees and there is no kind of structure above him, or it's being built around him. So that is the point. He can build that culture, and it's a lot easier as well to get rid of underperforming players at Ajax, where they're essentially, the whole model is built around moving players on once they reach a certain value. Whereas United's squad are on basically top of the market wages. They often command high fees, and that's why it's a lot harder to shift players like potentially Maguire in the summer and Sancho maybe next summer, who you don't want in the squad. It takes a huge amount of political capital, and I think Ten Hag is finding that the job is a lot harder than possibly the one that he took on.
OK, we're going to go to the back of the Sun now, and it says 10-1, and talking about 1-to-1 sessions being the answer, and also from Scott McTominay vows we'll fight like dogs. Sam, what do you make of these elements to this Manchester United story?
Yeah, well, McTominay is clearly becoming one of the go-to men when it comes to the club casting around for someone to do that sort of awful long walker down the media rights holders in the hour after a big defeat. I mean, it's never easy to find players to give post-match interviews after defeats, I'm sure, and even more difficult when the club's in a slump in the way that United are. So McTominay has taken that one for the team and come out and tried to put some sort of spin on it. There's actually, I mean, I've seen it 1,000 times in football. There's very little that can be said in these situations. The players know better than anyone that it's the results that will turn it around. It's going to be difficult because the numbers are starting to stack up in terms of defeats and points dropped, and just how far they are off the pace at the top of the league. So Saturday against Fulham becomes such a crucial game, because at some point they have to start picking up points and picking up wins, because with these, I think United are very, very reluctant. As we've been told for a long time, I don't know if that's changed in the last 24 hours. Very reluctant to sack Erik ten Hag, and clearly their statement today was quite strong. So they don't. It doesn't really feel like they have a plan B at the moment, which means that they really need to start turning things around. And yeah, we've seen this movie before. It's hard for a manager once he goes into a kind of decline like this to arrest it. But yeah, I mean, it's hard for players to say anything other than that they hope they can turn it around. He really needs a team on Saturday that's going to start rescuing him, because there aren't many more of these defeats that he can put a positive spin on.